Welcome back to Smile and Scars, the channel where real life encounters turn into unforgettable stories of courage, skill, and justice. Today's story is about a situation where police officers thought Chuck Norris wouldn't respond, and how quickly they learned they were completely wrong. It all started on a seemingly ordinary evening. Chuck Norris was visiting a local diner to grab a quick meal after a long day of training and public appearances. The diner was busy, filled with families, students, and regular customers, all immersed in their own conversations. Among the patrons were two police officers, off duty but in uniform, enjoying a late-night snack. They were known in the community for being a bit arrogant and overconfident, often testing boundaries to assert authority. The officers noticed Chuck Norris immediately. Some people in the diner recognized him and whispered quietly, but the officers didn't seem to care. They assumed that their badge and authority would overshadow anyone, even a celebrity martial artist like Norris. Their confidence quickly escalated into misjudgment. They believed he wouldn't react if they tried to provoke him. One of the officers decided to test the waters. He dropped a menu deliberately in Norris's direction, trying to get a reaction. Chuck, calm and composed, merely raised an eyebrow and picked up his napkin, seemingly unbothered. The officer's smirk widened. He mistook Chuck's patience for weakness. He nudged his partner and whispered loudly, "Watch this. He won't do anything, not a chance." The other officer, encouraged, decided to escalate. He bumped into Chuck Norris intentionally while reaching for the ketchup bottle, laughing as he did so. "Hey, watch it," Chuck said calmly but without anger. The officers laughed, assuming they had successfully embarrassed him in public. They were completely unaware of the storm they had just provoked. Chuck Norris's calm demeanor was misleading. Inside, he had recognized their arrogance and lack of respect. But unlike most people, he didn't need to raise his voice or react hastily to teach a lesson. Instead, he observed their movements, their postures, and the reactions of the surrounding diners. He noted the subtle signs of overconfidence, the misplaced sense of superiority, and the assumption that they could intimidate anyone. The officers continued their antics, now more emboldened. One of them reached across Chuck's table under the pretense of grabbing salt, trying to touch his arm lightly. Chuck Norris, still composed, paused his chewing, looked at the officer, and leaned slightly forward. His voice was quiet but carried an undeniable authority. "Gentlemen, I suggest you reconsider your behavior." Instead of heeding the warning, the officers laughed, mocking his tone and misinterpreting it as a joke. The diner fell silent, sensing the tension rising. Patrons watched curiously, unsure if a confrontation would erupt. Chuck's calm exterior gave no hint of the precision and skill ready to be deployed if necessary. The moment escalated when one of the officers decided to push the limit further. He deliberately knocked over a glass of water near Chuck's plate, laughing loudly. "Oops, my bad," he said, expecting Chuck to remain passive. But in that instant, Chuck Norris acted not with aggression, but with precise control. He lifted the glass without spilling it further, moved the table slightly, and positioned himself with perfect balance. The officers' laughter faded as they realized Chuck was no longer ignoring them. His movements were deliberate, silent, and unmistakably powerful. Every person in the diner could feel the shift in energy. What had seemed like a casual prank now carried consequences. Chuck's eyes locked onto the officers, conveying authority without raising his voice. Then, with a swift and controlled motion, Chuck Norris stood, positioning himself so that his presence alone commanded attention. One officer attempted another mock gesture, but before he could react, Chuck calmly but firmly redirected his momentum with a joint lock maneuver that neutralized the action instantly. The officer's arms were pinned gently but immovably behind his back. It wasn't violent. It was precise, controlled, and completely effective. The diner erupted in shocked whispers. Patrons leaned forward, astonished at the subtle but undeniable display of skill. Chuck Norris didn't shout or threaten. His calm authority and mastery of control were enough. The second officer froze, realizing immediately that they had misjudged him completely. The arrogance that had fueled their actions melted away in an instant. Chuck spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Respect is not optional. Actions have consequences." The words, simple and measured, carried a weight far beyond the sound. The officers, now fully aware of their miscalculation, remained silent, processing the immediate reversal of power. The lesson was clear. Underestimating Chuck Norris, or anyone with discipline and skill, could lead to instant regret. The officers' attempt at public humiliation had turned into a lesson in humility. Chuck guided them calmly to stand upright, releasing them only after ensuring they understood the severity of their behavior. By the end of the encounter, the officers were visibly shaken. They muttered apologies, their previous bravado replaced by caution and respect. Chuck Norris returned to his table, sitting calmly as if nothing had happened, reinforcing the lesson through controlled presence rather than aggression. The diner, once filled with tension and awkward anticipation, now buzzed with awe and admiration for the martial artist who had turned arrogance into a teaching moment. The next morning, the event from the diner were already circulating in the small town. The patrons who had witnessed Chuck Norris's composed but decisive response were still talking about it, replaying the moment when the officer's arrogance had been instantly neutralized. Word traveled quickly, and soon, even those who hadn't been present were eager to hear the story of how Chuck had handled the situation without raising his voice or escalating into violence. Meanwhile, the two police officers were dealing with the consequences of their own actions. They hadn't just humiliated themselves in public. They had underestimated a man whose reputation for skill and discipline was legendary. Their colleagues noticed a change in their behavior. The cocky swagger had vanished, replaced by hesitancy and self-consciousness. They were suddenly very aware that even the smallest act of disrespect could lead to unforeseen consequences. Chuck Norris, on the other hand, went about his day with remarkable composure. He didn't broadcast his triumph or revel in the humiliation of the officers. Instead, he focused on his routine, moving through the town, visiting friends, and attending to personal matters. Yet the memory of the encounter lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. It wasn't just about skill. It was about presence, awareness, and the ability to assert authority without aggression. Later that afternoon, Chuck received word from a local martial arts academy. The instructors wanted him to come for a demonstration, and of course, the two officers had also been invited to witness it. They felt compelled to attend, partially out of professional curiosity, partially out of a desire to save face, hoping to redeem their earlier behavior. Their arrival at the academy was marked by nervous glances and careful attempts to appear composed. But it was obvious to everyone present that the previous night's lesson had left an impression. Chuck began the session with a calm introduction. "Today, we're going to focus on awareness, control, and the use of skill in real-life situations," he said, addressing the students while maintaining a discreet but sharp eye on the officers. He didn't single them out, but his awareness of their presence was undeniable. Every movement, every demonstration, carried a subtle message about discipline, precision, and respect. The first demonstration involved situational awareness. Chuck explained how a person must constantly assess their surroundings, recognize potential threats, and respond with calculated precision. He walked the students through hypothetical scenarios, a crowded street, a heated argument, an unexpected physical confrontation. Each time he emphasized observation first, reaction second. The officers, watching quietly, began to recognize that their previous behavior had lacked these essential elements. Their overconfidence had blinded them to context, leaving them vulnerable to someone far more skilled. Next, Chuck demonstrated techniques for neutralizing aggression without escalation. Using slow, deliberate motions, he showed how to redirect momentum, apply holds, and control an opponent with minimal force. The students practiced in pairs under his guidance, and the officers, now acutely aware of their own shortcomings, joined reluctantly. Each time one of them attempted a forceful move, Chuck corrected them gently but firmly, reinforcing the principle that control, not strength, dictated the outcome. Throughout the session, Chuck emphasized restraint. Skill without restraint is dangerous, he explained. The goal is not to dominate or humiliate, but to neutralize a threat safely and effectively. Aggression alone is a liability. The officers absorbed the lesson silently, understanding more deeply with each passing demonstration how their impulsive actions had nearly led to disaster. They had laughed at the idea of provoking Chuck Norris, but now they were learning that true mastery required patience, awareness, and humility. Chuck also addressed the psychological aspects of confrontation. He explained that confidence, presence, and calmness often prevent situations from escalating. The smallest gestures, maintaining eye contact, controlling breathing, projecting calm, could disarm an aggressor before physical intervention became necessary. The officers, reflecting on their actions at the diner, realized they had done everything wrong. They had mocked, escalated, and assumed superiority without consideration for consequence. During a practical exercise, Chuck created a scenario where one student played the role of an aggressive individual, while another had to respond using awareness and control. The officers found themselves paired together, tasked with demonstrating restraint and proper technique. The exercise exposed how easily arrogance could undermine effectiveness. Their initial attempts were clumsy, reactive, and forceful, highlighting exactly why their diner antics had failed. Under Chuck's guidance, however, they began to understand how composure and calculated response could entirely change the outcome. The demonstration was interspersed with anecdotes from Chuck's experiences. He recounted situations where overconfidence or lack of awareness had led to unnecessary risk, emphasizing that even the most skilled individual must rely on observation, patience, and humility. Each story reinforced the lesson that power without control or skill without respect could result in instant regret. The officers listened intently, now fully aware that their previous assumptions had been naive at best, reckless at worst. As the session continued, Chuck introduced techniques for disengagement and safety. He demonstrated how to diffuse tension verbally, how to position oneself safely, and how to apply minimal physical force when absolutely necessary. The officers, participating cautiously, began to appreciate the subtleties involved. The practical application of these skills was eye-opening. They realized that real authority came from knowledge and precision, not from badge or bravado. By late afternoon, the students were practicing under Chuck's watchful eye, and the officers had grown noticeably more focused. The tension from the diner incident had transformed into a willingness to learn. Chuck's calm, composed approach had turned what could have been humiliation into an opportunity for growth. The lesson wasn't delivered with anger. It was delivered through mastery, awareness, and presence. Before concluding the session, Chuck addressed the entire group, including the officers. "Every action has a consequence," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Arrogance can lead to regret, but humility and awareness create safety. Respect must be earned and maintained through discipline, not assumed through force." The words resonated deeply. The officers, now silent, nodded in acknowledgement. The diner incident was no longer just a memory of public embarrassment. It had become a lesson in personal and professional growth. As the session ended, Chuck spent a few moments privately with the officers. He offered guidance, correction, and encouragement. "Learn from this," he said. "Do not let arrogance blind you. Skill is useless without awareness, and authority is meaningless without respect." The officers, humbled, expressed gratitude. They understood that their mistake had been severe, but that they now had an opportunity to improve under the guidance of a true master. By the time the students and officers left the academy, the town had already absorbed fragments of the story. Witnesses recounted the diner incident and the academy demonstration, emphasizing how Chuck Norris had neutralized arrogance and taught lessons of respect and discipline without raising his voice. The narrative spread quickly, a tale of authority, composure, and instant regret for those who underestimated skill and patience. In retrospect, the incident revealed multiple truths. It wasn't just about Chuck Norris's physical skill. It was about the power of calm, awareness, and disciplined response. The officers had learned firsthand that assumptions based on position or bravado were dangerous. The students witnessed a living example of mastery, not just in movement, but in presence, judgment, and decision-making under pressure. By the end of Part 2, it was clear that the story had transformed from a minor diner incident into a comprehensive lesson in awareness, discipline, and the consequences of arrogance. Chuck Norris had demonstrated how skill, patience, and composure could turn a potentially humiliating situation into a life-altering lesson for those involved. The officers' immediate regret had evolved into a deeper understanding of responsibility, control, and respect. The following day, the town was still abuzz with stories of Chuck Norris and the officers. Word had traveled fast. Everyone wanted to know how a seemingly minor incident at a diner had escalated into a lesson that no one would soon forget. Chuck himself, however, remained calm, focused on his routine and the ongoing work he had in the town. For him, it was simply another day, another opportunity to demonstrate the importance of skill, awareness, and composure. The two officers, however, were anything but calm. Their previous arrogance had been replaced by a mixture of respect, humility, and anxiety. They knew that public perception had already judged them harshly, but they also understood that they had a chance to learn from someone far more experienced. The embarrassment from the diner incident had transitioned into determination. They wanted to prove that they could internalize the lesson and improve themselves. That morning, Chuck visited a local community center to conduct a workshop for students, martial artists, and anyone interested in self-defense. The two officers attended as observers at first, unsure of whether to participate actively. Chuck began by greeting everyone with his characteristic calm authority. Today, we will focus not only on physical skill, but also on situational awareness, patience, and the consequences of our actions, he said. His words were measured and deliberate, immediately drawing the attention of every person in the room. Chuck started with demonstrations that emphasized awareness over aggression. He showed how to read body language, anticipate movements, and maintain control without escalating a confrontation. Each move he performed was precise, fluid, and deliberate, capturing the attention of both the audience and the officers. The officers were visibly attentive, realizing that their previous actions had lacked this level of control and foresight. Next, Chuck introduced exercises focused on de-escalation. He paired participants and had them practice responding to mock threats with calm, calculated movements. The officers were assigned to work with each other, practicing techniques that required patience and awareness. Their initial attempts were clumsy, as they struggled to restrain themselves from using brute force. Chuck's guidance, however, was unwavering. Each correction was gentle but firm, emphasizing that true strength came from restraint, not aggression. Throughout the exercises, Chuck shared anecdotes from his own life. He recounted situations where overconfidence or impatience had led to unnecessary risk, highlighting the importance of observation, timing, and respect for others. The officers listened intently, reflecting on their own behavior at the diner. Every story reinforced the lesson. Arrogance without skill or awareness inevitably leads to regret. During a particularly challenging exercise, Chuck created a scenario that simulated a crowded public space. Participants had to respond to multiple threats while maintaining control and composure. The officers were pushed to their limits, forced to navigate pressure and unpredictability. Each time they faltered, Chuck calmly corrected them, showing the subtle adjustments that made all the difference. By the end of the exercise, they began to grasp how their impulsive actions at the diner had left them vulnerable and exposed. Chuck emphasized the mental aspect of martial arts and self-defense. He explained that composure, focus, and awareness are just as important as physical ability. "Your mind is your most powerful tool," he said. "Without control over your thoughts and reactions, even the strongest person can be defeated." The officers nodded in agreement, realizing how much their pride and lack of mindfulness had contributed to their humiliation. After a brief break, Chuck focused on practical techniques for neutralizing aggression with minimal force. He demonstrated redirection, joint locks, and controlled holds that allowed an individual to maintain safety without inflicting unnecessary harm. The officers were paired with students to practice these moves. Their initial hesitation gave way to growing understanding, as they saw firsthand how composure and precision outmatched raw strength. Chuck then introduced verbal strategies for conflict resolution. He explained how calm communication, tone of voice, and body language could prevent many confrontations before they became physical. The officers reflected on their actions, realizing that had they approached the diner incident differently, the situation could have been diffused without embarrassment or risk. The lesson was comprehensive. Mastery involved not only physical skill, but also mental acuity and emotional intelligence. As the workshop progressed, Chuck challenged the participants with surprise scenarios, testing their ability to respond under pressure. The officers, now fully aware of the importance of observation and restraint, performed with greater care and deliberation. Chuck observed silently, offering subtle guidance and corrections. The officers' transformation was evident. They were no longer reactive or arrogant, but focused, deliberate, and respectful. The final segment of the workshop involved self-reflection. Chuck asked participants to consider how their actions affected others, and what lessons could be applied beyond martial arts. The officers realized that their diner behavior had not only embarrassed themselves, but had also affected public perception of their authority. They acknowledged that respect must be earned through conduct, not assumed through uniform or bravado. At the conclusion of the workshop, Chuck gathered everyone for a closing statement. "Remember, skill without awareness is useless. Power without restraint is dangerous. Arrogance leads to instant regret, but humility, patience, and discipline create true strength. Apply these lessons in every aspect of your life." His words resonated with the entire room, leaving a lasting impression on students and officers alike. The officers approached Chuck privately before leaving. "We understand now," one of them said. "We misjudged you, and ourselves. Thank you for the lesson." Chuck nodded, his expression calm but authoritative. "Let this experience guide your actions from now on. Respect and awareness are not optional, they are essential." The officers left with a newfound understanding, humbled but motivated to embody the principles they had learned. By the evening, the story of the diner incident and the subsequent workshop had spread throughout the town. Locals marveled at how Chuck Norris had handled the situation. Not with anger, not with aggression, but with calm authority, skill, and strategic teaching. The officers' public humiliation had transformed into an example of personal growth and professional development. People shared the story widely, emphasizing the lesson that underestimating someone with discipline and mastery carries immediate consequences. Reflecting on the events, it was clear that the encounter had lasting effects. The officers had learned humility, the students had witnessed mastery, and the town had seen a demonstration of the power of composure and awareness. Chuck Norris's actions had transformed what could have been a moment of conflict into a comprehensive lesson in skill, respect, and control. Even weeks later, those involved continued to talk about the incident. The officers' behavior changed permanently. They approached situations with greater mindfulness, patience, and awareness. Students applied the techniques and philosophies Chuck had shared. understanding that mastery extended beyond physical skill to encompass observation, mental discipline, and ethical conduct. The story became a reference point for teaching personal growth and the consequences of arrogance. In conclusion, what began as a minor act of disrespect in a diner evolved into a profound lesson for everyone involved. Chuck Norris's calm authority, precision, and strategic teaching turned potential conflict into an opportunity for learning. The officer's immediate regret became long-term growth, and the town learned the value of respect, awareness, and mastery. The story remains a powerful reminder: never underestimate skill and discipline, and never assume that arrogance will go unchallenged. Chuck Norris didn't just respond. He transformed the situation into a teaching moment that would resonate far beyond the diner walls.